As crazy as it is to think that all that time has passed already, today marks 5 years since the launch of Call of Duty Warzone, a game that to me defined a global pandemic and despite all its flaws will go down in history as one of the biggest video game sensations of all time. As a lifelong fan of Call of Duty, but one who had sort of lost the love for the franchise in those years leading up to the Modern Warfare reboot, this game managed to drag me back in and somehow had me hooked like I had never been hooked before. Games like H1Z1, PUBG, Fortnite and Apex Legends had sort of paved the way for this battle royale genre, and then came along the behemoth that is Call of Duty. Despite realistically failing with their first attempt at a BR in Blackout, they really did push the envelope with their next iteration in Warzone, innovating on the already loved genre by adding stuff like loadouts, contracts, buy stations, and who could forget the now iconic Gulag. On top of that, right around the time that Warzone launched, we faced unprecedented times due to the global pandemic, and with so many people around the world facing lockdown for months at a time with nothing better to do than watch Netflix or play video games, it could not have been a more perfect time for Warzone to announce itself as the best new addition to the fastest growing genre in gaming. And so today, for its 5-year anniversary, I wanted to take a look back at Warzone, specifically that sort of iconic Verdansk era of the game, and try and dissect what made this game so special to so many people around the world. We're going to be diving deep into the launch and rise of Warzone in the midst of a global pandemic, the areas in which Warzone innovated on the already exploding battle royale genre, the phenomenal level design of the now iconic Verdansk, the countless memories and overall euphoria created by this game, and then lastly, the beginning of the end as Warzone started to unfortunately decline into the state that it currently is today. So sit back, grab a drink and relax, because this is no doubt going to be one long trip down memory lane. So let's go back to the 10th of March 2020. Modern Warfare had released a few months prior, back in October of 2019, and the base game itself definitely released to some very mixed reviews, with most people agreeing that although the gameplay and the more realistic approach was all done really well, some technical issues as well as a really fast time to kill that resulted in a bit of a camp fest in most game modes left the community feeling a little bit down about the launch of Modern Warfare. But a few months later, in came Warzone, their new iteration of the Battle Royale mode within Call of Duty, after their previous attempt in Blackout, which was the Black Ops 4 version, was somewhat of a failure, at least by Call of Duty standards anyway. A large part of that was that it wasn't free to play, therefore only Black Ops 4 owners were able to play it, and over time that just resulted in a smaller, unsustainable player base when compared with the other battle royales of the time like Fortnite and Apex, both free to play, and even PUBG, which was only about $20 as far as I remember. This time though, Activision learned their lesson and Warzone was completely free to play, opening the doors to the masses, and that absolutely showed in their initial numbers, with the game amassing 6 million players within the first 24 hours and a total of 15 million players within 3 days of launching. Now, even with the success, I think there was still a fair bit of skepticism over the first few weeks of launch from those like myself who'd lost the love for Call of Duty over the years, and a lot of people maybe just didn't trust that it was actually as good as people were saying it was. I specifically remember streaming on one of my other channels and someone popped into the chat to ask if I was going to play Warzone or not, and I remember just replying, nah, probably not, because I'd really just lost the love for Call of Duty over the years and didn't really trust that this was actually a good game. But literally 10 days after the game launched, at least here in Australia, as it was obviously very different timing for everyone else in the world, we went into lockdown due to the pandemic. And it's weird to say, but I think the pandemic is maybe the single most crucial element as to what made this game as special as it was. While the game itself was phenomenal despite plenty of flaws, and while it would have been a huge success either way, I do think that COVID kind of gave it this sort of lightning in a bottle element that is just 1 in a million. What are the odds that a game this good from a franchise as big and popular, but also as negatively trending as Call of Duty, would launch 10 days before the entire world went into lockdown, where people were spending their entire life at home with essentially nothing better to do than play video games. It was just the perfect storm that not a single person could have predicted, and I think that is part of why there is so much nostalgia attached to Warzone, because not only was it a great game, worthy of that nostalgia in its own right, but it's also so heavily linked with easily the most absurd time in any of our lives, a time where there was just so much confusion and uncertainty about just everyday life in general. We didn't know how long the lockdowns would last. Many of us didn't know if we'd retain our jobs afterwards or if life would be permanently changed. We didn't know when we'd get to see certain friends or family members, or even something as simple as when our next freaking haircut would be. But what we did know was that we had the safety net every single day of being able to jump on Warzone, catch up with friends, or jump into an intense solo game and just kind of forget about the state of the world, almost like none of it was even happening. When you look back at it now, that time period was easily one of the worst time periods in most of our lives. It spawned its own mental health crisis. People were struggling for money, locked away in our own homes like prisoners. People were dying. It was just an all-around pretty shit time to be alive. And yet, as genuinely insane as this might sound, I wouldn't trade that time of my life for anything. Life was pretty damn terrible, and yet I have this strange sense of nostalgia for those couple of months, hell, if not the majority of the year 2020, to where I look back at it as somehow one of the most memorable and weirdly enjoyable time periods of my life. It almost reminds me a little bit of looking back in my school years, where realistically I kind of hated school when I was that age. At least I thought I did anyway, because looking back at it now, I love that time of my life, and it feels weirdly the same with the lockdowns. Now, the reason I say all of this is because, as far as I'm concerned, about 95% of that feeling comes purely from Warzone and my love of that game and that experience. When I think of lockdown, I think of Warzone, and it's fair to say that when I think of Warzone, at least this era of Warzone that I'm talking about, from launch to the end of that Verdansk period, I think of some of the most enjoyable gaming experiences I've ever had, even with 20 plus years of being a gamer. Now, it clearly wasn't just me that enjoyed the game, as after that initial spike of 15 million players in 3 days, it just continued to grow and grow and grow over the rest of the year. Only 1 week after that milestone, it reached 30 million players, and about a year later, in April of 2021, it eventually reached a player base of 100 million players, a number that is extremely rare to see across any franchise in gaming. Athletes as big as LeBron James and Neymar Jr. were talking about the game online. There were crossovers with some of the biggest franchises in the world, and it was clear after about a month of launch that this game was hitting levels we'd not really seen before outside of Fortnite and maybe GTA 5, but even that feels like it was a bit more self-contained than Warzone was. This game was absolutely everywhere. One of the craziest parts about all of this too was that it gave Call of Duty as a franchise such a massive boost that it took even that, which was already huge, to a whole other level. It almost rebooted Call of Duty as a franchise, alongside Modern Warfare being a literal reboot already. People quickly noticed that by buying the main game of Modern Warfare, you were able to level up your guns and unlock new ones a whole lot faster in the regular multiplayer modes, and therefore those 100 million total players were increasingly more likely to buy the main game itself, massively increasing sales and therefore overall revenue for Activision, who were clearly already doing pretty well before that. All of this, the quality of the game, the innovation, the lockdowns, the return of Call of Duty, it just resulted in the launch of what feels to me like this almost once in a lifetime experience of a video game that I know I'll still look back on in 20 or 30 years as one of the best multiplayer experiences I've ever had and probably ever will have. Like I mentioned earlier, there had already been a few games prior to Warzone that really paved the way for the BR genre. And although H1Z1 was one of the first, for me, the big three were PUBG, then Fortnite, and then finally Apex. These games were already dominating the industry, and the BR mode in general was already in a great spot where it still felt new and exciting, but also didn't really feel like it was underdone or needed huge innovation in order to push it forward. Its trajectory was already headed straight to the moon. This is one area though where, in my opinion, Warzone proved that to be very wrong indeed. When it came along, not only did it do everything that those games did to pretty much the same level of quality, but it did really push the envelope too in terms of new additions and innovations to what we'd seen so far in Battle Royales. Now, the most notable to me, and I think to most people, was the Gulag. One point of friction with BRs when it came to new or more casual players is how frustrating and often helpless they can make you feel when you're 20 minutes into a game only to die in a way that maybe isn't your fault, or in a way that just one extra split second to react might have ended in a gunfight going your way. It can be kind of depressing to get that far into a game only to die and have to start all over again. But the Gulag kind of fixed that, or at least slightly improved it anyway. Now you had the chance to redeem yourself and fight in a 1v1 to earn your way back into the Warzone, where you'd get a second chance at bringing home a win. It was a simple but very clever way of giving people an extra chance, a literal get out of jail free card, but at the same time added so much intensity to a mode that was already intense as it was. Once you found yourself in the Gulag, there was nowhere to hide your skill level, there was nowhere to hide your mentality. 99 times out of 100, it was the best player or the player who handled pressure better than the other that would make their way out of the Gulag and back into the fight. A straight up 1v1 like the good old days on Rust, but this time with a randomized weapon each time and your dead squad mates spectating you to add even more pressure on your shoulders. A lot of people eventually cottoned onto the fact as well that if you and your teammates were both in the Gulag at the same time, you'd be able to make callouts for your teammates while they were in their 1v1, as you'd have the overhead view of the map while you were waiting for your turn. On one hand, this resulted in some awesome team up moments where you'd help your mate get a win and get back into the game, and on the other hand, at least playing with my mates anyway, it'd often result in some hilarious moments where you would purposely give wrong instructions, or hell, accidentally get your lefts and rights mixed up since you were watching from the opposite angle, resulting in your teammate dying and absolutely cracking the shits at you. It really just added a whole other layer to the social aspect of the game that is so memorable to me. Now, despite the Gulag being, in my opinion, one of the best additions of all time to the Battle Royale genre, it wasn't without its flaws either. Completely unbalanced loadouts would sometimes throw you off and cause you to lose. Sometimes enemies would just camp in the back corner or wait for the overtime flag. And for some reason, there were often loadouts with flashbangs or stuns that were just completely OP if you used it before your enemy did, giving you pretty much a free win even if you didn't deserve it. Early on too, there were even some fist-only loadouts that were just so dumb and frustrating because it was literally just the first player to land a punch wins. Though I can't lie, it is pretty funny in hindsight to think back on that. Two random people online locked in a prison bathroom just desperately throwing hands at each other in order to stop getting roasted by their teammates. Outside of the Gulag, I think the next best innovation for me was definitely the loadout drops and customizable loadouts, which, just like the Gulag, had never really been seen in any other BRs to date. BRs had always been founded on that sort of looter-shooter element where you needed to drop into the map, find random loot, and defend yourself with whatever you could manage to find. But Warzone sort of took that, kept it, but then also shook things up without completely removing that element either. With roughly 10 to 15 seconds left of the first circle closing in within each match, you'd receive your first free loadout drop that would drop completely at random, usually within about 150 or so meters of you and your team, but it would also usually drop with multiple other loadouts, those being for other teams located in your area too. The ability to actually get your own handcrafted loadout rather than solely relying on what you and other players in the game found on the ground or in chests was, in my opinion, one of the best ways to balance the game and the fairness around winning, because every other BR had the element of completely random luck where some players might win or lose games almost purely based on the loot that they find. If you were the best player in the lobby but just found the worst weapons imaginable, sometimes you would die when you probably didn't deserve it. Now, don't get me wrong, that is actually a huge part of the charm when it comes to battle royales, that there is the element of luck involved, and as weird as it sounds, it is also a completely fair way of doing it, even though sometimes it doesn't really feel like it. No one was promised anything when they jumped into the map, so the game does start off completely fair, and from there it really is just random chance. But the best part about the loadouts is that, like I said, they did give everyone a level playing field once they dropped into the map at the end of the first circle, while the beginning of the game also had that completely random aspect to it too, meaning you kind of got the best of both worlds and you were forced into a chaotic early game where you had to scramble for good loot and survive your initial gunfights. But you also had the benefit of getting exactly what you wanted once things slowed down a bit at the end of the first circle, usually about 8 or 9 minutes into the game. Now, that being said, it wasn't always a walk in the park getting your hands on your loadouts in the first place. With enemy loadouts dropping nearby too, it meant that often you need to fight for the loadout with another team who were already there when you rocked up, or maybe you got there first, but as you're preparing to leave, an enemy vehicle rolls in, and all of a sudden, you go from feeling safe, getting your loadout and preparing for the next phase of the game, to randomly being thrust into a life or death gunfight where both teams are desperate to escape safely with their own handcrafted loadouts. Later in the game, this was even more true because around the time of the 5th circle, pretty much in the final phase of the match, another free loadout would drop, and obviously because the game was in such a late stage as well as a much smaller map at this point, these ones often felt like suicide missions, but an absolutely necessary suicide mission because you couldn't go into the end game without your loadout. There was just such a low chance of winning games that way, at least for the majority of the play base. Loadout drops for me are definitely one of those things that really defined this game and separated it from the rest of the BRs out there. We'd never really seen anything like this done in previous BR installments, and to me this was just the perfect way to balance out the game once things settled down, while also adding another intense element into the mix with the actual dropping of the loadouts randomly throughout the world, meaning players had to fight over them. Now, we had seen that done before in PUBG, but that was a little bit different. It only really affected one single team, but in Warzone, they found a way to make it work for everyone in the game. Therefore, it became much more of a staple than the airdrops in PUBG, albeit those were also probably a little bit more exciting because of that. Now, one other way of getting your loadout was literally just buying one at any given moment throughout the game from another great innovation in this game known as the buy stations. These added not only a lot more strategy to the game as well as another element to the loot system in terms of being able to loot cash, but they even added yet another safety net for newer players in the ability to buy back teammates when they died and lost their gulag. Again, like many other things in this game, Apex had done something similar to this with their respawn beacons, where in that game, if a teammate died, you could pick up a tag off their body and then take it to a respawn beacon to bring them back. But in Warzone, they took that mechanic to a whole other level. For a price of about 4,500 or later 4,000 once they lowered it, you could buy teammates back at almost any stage of the game, with the exception being the late game once they had announced buybacks and gulag respawns were now closed. This was another amazing part of Warzone that really helped with the more casual player base in more ways than one. Obviously, for newer players, it is a hard game to get used to when people have been playing Call of Duty for decades, and so if you died early in a game and just could not get back until the next round, which might be 25 or more minutes away, that's not a very enjoyable experience for anyone. On the other side of it too, if you were newer or more casual and your really good teammate died, not being able to have their guidance throughout the game meant that you'd be pretty much destined for a loss if you couldn't get them back into the game in order to help you out. Buybacks as a mechanic almost single-handedly guided so many new players from casual to hardcore fans, in my opinion, because even just looking at the mates that I played with, I know for a fact if they had to sit around for 25 minutes every game until we got into the next one, they'd never have stuck around as long as they did with this game. But because we could buy them back, they knew they only had to sit tight for a few minutes before we got them back into the fight, and it just made for a much more enjoyable experience for everyone. On top of buying back teammates though, buy stations had a lot of other benefits that added even further to the overall depth of the game. From UAVs, armor plates, self-revives, and even traditional kill streaks like precision airstrikes and cluster strikes, there was just so much more strategy added to the game, which all sort of revolved around you needing to gather money to spend at these buy stations. Now, in my opinion, that really upped the tempo of the game too, unless you were just absolutely set with everything you could possibly carry, there wasn't really any reason to just go and find a nice building to hide in until the final circle like there was in games like PUBG. You had a reason to go out and try and actually kill enemies, loot their bodies, and therefore set yourself up even better for the end game. Being able to buy loadouts as well was another thing that set the good teams apart from the rest. If you could grab 10k early enough in a game and get a loadout, you'd be able to absolutely send it from the beginning of the game and rack up kill after kill on enemies who weren't quite set up yet. And so it just added another layer to the strategic side of the game. In a lot of other BRs out there, you generally land, defend yourself, and then kind of play it pretty slow for the most part. In Warzone though, often the goal was to land, try and get $18,000, and you could buy your loadout alongside 2 UAVs. Once you use the first UAV, you'd pick the closest team on the map, head over to them and get ready for a fight, all the while they didn't even know you were there yet. Once you were close, you'd pop that second UAV to reveal them on the map once again, and from there, you and your team could basically have your way with them, provided they weren't just far better than you, which honestly happened to me and the boys quite a bit. We would just go in way too confident into a gunfight, only to 60 seconds later find ourselves back in the lobby searching for a new game. But honestly, those provided some of the funniest moments in all of my time playing Warzone. Another great innovation in this game, which tied in perfectly with this monetary system and the buy stations, was the contract system. Again, another mechanic that, as far as I'm aware, hadn't really been done before. At launch, there were about 4 or 5 contracts you could choose from that would spawn at random on the map, and each of them would give you a bit of a bonus for doing them, usually in the form of some money and XP, as well as a few other benefits too. From bounties, which marked an enemy team on the map for you to hunt down within the 3-minute timer, to scavengers that pinged 3 chests on the map for you to loot within that time limit, to most wanteds, which would actually mark you and your team on the map for all enemies to see, but surviving the 3 or 4 minutes would result in a huge cash reward. There were just so many fun additions that kind of gave you and the team something to do in those slower moments where you'd maybe cleared out an area and were just kind of waiting for the circle to close in. There was the age-old strategy of doing the recon contracts too, where you'd have to go to a radio beacon, capture the point for a certain amount of time, all the while showing a flare way up in the sky above your team to kind of alert nearby enemies of your intentions. But if you managed to complete it safely, it would then show the next circle on the map to give you an idea of where you needed to be. If you did about 5 or 6 of these in a row, which was obviously easier said than done, you could then pinpoint the location of the final circle in the game. And if you really wanted to, you could just go there already and get set up in a little house or some cover and wait for the circle and remaining players to close in around you. These all just offered so many ways to play the game, while also being completely avoidable if you just wanted to literally run around and do whatever you wanted. And to me, they are just another element, like the loadouts, the gulag, and the buy stations, that just gave this game so much identity. Like, they knew exactly what they wanted this game to be, something we unfortunately can't really say about the current iteration of Warzone. While the game most certainly had a lot of flaws and issues throughout its lifespan, these innovations are sort of what painted over the cracks for me personally. They took a game mode or a genre that was really booming already, added their own quality Call of Duty gunplay and movement to it, but then genuinely elevated it to a whole other level through some of these new features that still to this day are some of the best overall innovations that I think the BR genre has ever seen. To me personally, Verdansk is the single most iconic BR map of all time, and up there as one of the most iconic maps in general in any shooter that I've ever played. I know that's probably a hot take with so many classic maps out there, and I know even when it comes to just BR maps, the OG Fortnite map as well as Erangel from PUBG, those are definitely in the same conversation too, and I don't think I'd really die on the hill if someone wanted to argue that those maps were better. But to me, it just has such a significance in gaming culture, seeing as it is so heavily linked with the pandemic, as well as that initial booming rise of Warzone. Now, one of the biggest elements to its success was the 150 player count right from the beginning of Warzone, which at the time, and I think even currently, is essentially the highest player count that any of the more popular BR modes have had. It meant for even more chaotic starts with so many people dropping into the map at once, but it also meant that games were just a tad longer, and the most exciting part, it meant that you had more of a chance of racking up some really high kill games due to the increased player count. Because of the sheer number of players, that did also mean that Verdansk had to be pretty damn big, and that it definitely was. From wide open ranges where it felt like a suicide mission to even consider running across the airstrip or running across the frozen lake at the dam, to intense close quarters areas like downtown or the hospital, Verdansk kind of just had everything that any player could want when it comes to great map design. Unlike the BR titles before it, Warzone had the benefit of being able to include fan favorite points of interest, or POIs, where in some cases they literally just added whole maps from old Modern Warfare titles as their own locations on the map, such as the TV station being based on broadcasts from the original Modern Warfare in 2007, the Boneyard being based on Scrapyard from Modern Warfare 2, and plenty of other locations that weren't direct copies but were obviously very heavily inspired by old maps such as Terminal, Block, and Prison from the campaign of Modern Warfare 2 as well. Using these iconic locations while seamlessly blending them into the map was one of the main reasons that Verdansk became so iconic. It blended the old with the new in a way that didn't stand out like a sore thumb or feel like it was relying too heavily on nostalgia. In fact, I remember throughout the first few weeks of playing, there were a few areas that I didn't even notice right away were based on some of the old maps. Yet when I did remember, it just made me love those areas even more. One POI that wasn't based on an old location was Superstore, and this to me is probably one of the most iconic locations in all of Verdansk due to how chaotic it was at the start of any game. This was what most people considered to be the hot drop of this map, albeit there were a few others too, like Downtown or Hospital, but Superstore was where it was at when you just wanted to drop in and immediately be in the thick of it. I fell so in love with hot dropping at Superstore that when I would play solos, I genuinely think my drop rate would have been about 80% of games dropping at Superstore. There was just nothing more intense than dropping here and seeing about 20 other players dropping there too. As low of a chance of survival as it was compared to pretty much any other area on the map, the thing I always had in the back of my mind, at least in solos, was that if I did manage to pick up 5 or 6 kills off the rip, likely taking out some of the better players in the lobby too, since this is where most of the better players dropped, then your chances of winning that game and getting a high kill game increased drastically if you managed to make it out of there alive. The sheer adrenaline of dropping here game after game is something that I will literally never forget. It was almost a mini battle royale in itself. Like the last man standing went from a 1% chance of winning to a 10% chance of winning, and I think that is a big part of why so many people dropped here. Now, for me and my mates, military base was also one of our favorites, and we got to the point where we'd be comfortable enough to land all in our own little separate areas of that point of interest, take out squads pretty much on our own, and end up with about $35,000 5 minutes into the game if everything went to plan, while also being in a great position due to the tactical advantage this area of the map gave you when you're pushing down the hill into the rest of the map. That was one thing about Verdansk that they just absolutely nailed, and really no Warzone map since has managed to do the same thing. The flow of this map was just absolutely perfect. The start was chaotic, then it sort of flattened out a bit after those first couple of gunfights, allowing you to reassess your situation, loot up, and then look to get moving onto the next area, where only a minute or two later you'd have driven or flown to a new POI to engage in more gunfights with other squads. The POIs were perfectly spread out throughout Verdansk that they all felt far enough away, and they also had their own level of isolation, and yet whether by foot or by vehicle, it wasn't that far to get to the next area. The layout of the land overall too allowed for so many different ways to rotate from point to point. You could take the fast but maybe riskier path, but most of the time the map also allowed for a slower but safer, more cover-friendly pathway, and it just allowed you to approach each match however you wanted. I think something else that was so underrated about this map design too though, which even I have just inadvertently done, is that the non-POI areas were just as crucial, if not more crucial, to the success of the map, and some of those random areas around the map that don't even have names are some of the most iconic well-designed pieces of Verdansk. These areas were the glue that held the POIs together. Hell, they were the glue that held Verdansk together in general, and I think that's something that doesn't get enough props when we think back on the peak of Warzone. Some of my most memorable wins, whether they were with mates or playing solos, came in areas where, watching this gameplay back, I can hardly even remember where the hell this part of the map is. Sometimes you'd get a final circle that was legitimately just right on the edge of the map in the middle of absolutely nowhere, with like 3 trees and a rock as the only pieces of cover outside of using the terrain itself to your advantage. As iconic as the OG Fortnite map was, the ability to build meant that the map didn't quite feel as important at the end of games. Unless you were in Tilted Towers or somewhere like that, it felt like your own building was far more important than the map itself. But in Warzone, there was none of that, much the same as PUBG and H1Z1 back in the day, and it meant that the map kind of had to be awesome in order for those final moments to be fair and balanced, while also being refreshing and different each time. Some games would end in downtown with 2 skyscrapers being the final 2 buildings you could access, while some games would end in the farmland with a single hay bale as the only cover to fight over, and it resulted in every single game feeling different than the last. To me, they did this at such a better level than they ever managed in Warzone 2 with Al Mazrah, even though I did really like that map, but it just didn't hit the levels that Verdansk hit. As for the current iteration of Warzone, I guess Warzone 3, I have literally not played one single game of that due to just losing the love for it over the course of Warzone 2, and this win that you can see right here, recorded back in December of 2022, is the last recording I've ever taken of Warzone, which is honestly pretty sad to say, because as much of a downfall as there has been, Warzone is probably in my top 5, hell even top 3 multiplayer experiences of all time. Now Verdansk is coming back very soon, apparently on March 20th in the current iteration of Warzone, albeit that hasn't been confirmed as I'm recording this, but we know it is coming back soon, and I won't lie, I'm kind of torn about it. On one hand, I know me and the boys are 100% going to be jumping back on and running it back one last time on the classic map that is Verdansk, reliving some of those memorable years of playing this map and no doubt feeling like absolute boomers in doing so. On the other hand, I just know already that it's not going to hit the same, and that we'll jump on full of hope thinking we're about to relive some of the best memories of our 20s, only to realize about half an hour into the session that it's just not the same game we remember. And honestly, I'm already sad in advance about that, because I think we all just want to play one last session on the Warzone that we know and love. Either way, I am glad that Verdansk is coming back, and hell, even if it sucks, it's going to be awesome seeing every streamer, every YouTuber, everyone on Twitter and TikTok just sharing clips and funny moments from the map that we all fell in love with back in 2020. And even though it's not going to live up to the old days, I do think it's going to be fun to take a trip down memory lane on this map just for old time's sake. And despite my pessimistic feelings about modern day Warzone, I am very much looking forward to playing this map one last time. Now, throughout the video, I've talked a lot about my memories with this game and the things that made me fall in love, and while a huge part of that is obviously just the whole pandemic situation, being locked inside for months and having nothing better to do than play Warzone with the boys, a huge part of it is also just to do with the design of the game itself. It wasn't just good because of COVID, it was genuinely a very good game at the same time. One thing that I think it nailed that none of the prior BRs had managed to do yet was getting the right mix of being realistic and gritty while also being arcadey enough with smooth movement and gunplay to where casuals could pick it up and not feel like they're playing some super niche milsim that took itself way too seriously. Looking at a game like PUBG, although that was a phenomenal game and I have so many fun memories playing it, it was at times maybe a little bit too focused on realism and being more of a hardcore BR or shooter, to where I think the actual mechanics of the game, the movement, the gunplay and all that stuff did lack a little bit. It wasn't as crisp or fluid as most other shooters, despite many areas still being done really well. Looking at Fortnite on the other hand, that game had some really smooth gameplay even at launch. The building, love it or hate it, was very fluid and added a nice skill curve, and overall it probably nailed that arcadey, easy to learn gameplay loop that made it so successful in the first place. The downside to that, of course, not that most Fortnite players cared, but I think a lot of people on the outside did, was that it wasn't a realistic shooter at all. Instead, it was a very cartoony and almost childlike game. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's obviously just not going to be for everyone. But with Warzone, I think the reason it resonated so much with so many players around the world is that it almost felt like the perfect mix of a game like PUBG, gritty, grounded and realistic, as well as Fortnite, arcadey, smooth and purely made for fun. It looked the part, looked like a real-life Warzone in a realistic setting, while also not taking itself too seriously either, as it was fast-paced, fun and very chaotic. They had the benefit of having Call of Duty gameplay, which, whether you love or hate Call of Duty, you cannot deny it is obviously very well made, as there's a reason COD has always dominated the shooter market. While it's not for everyone, the core mechanics like the gunplay and the movement have always been up there as some of the best across any shooter in the industry, and so dropping those into a BR while also innovating in some of the areas that I mentioned earlier on, that was just bound to be a recipe for success, especially after already trying it once with Blackout and sort of learning what didn't work in that game. All of this resulted in it being very easy to pick up for any player you can think of. Hardcore FPS player? You'll most likely enjoy it. Never played a shooter but always thought they looked fun? Well, you'll most likely enjoy it. Played some COD back in the day but you're more of a casual player? You will most likely enjoy it too. It was accessible for anyone and everyone, which timed with the insanity that was being in lockdown meant it couldn't have launched at a better time to onboard as many people as they could have possibly imagined. What helped even further was just how massive the game was in the online space too. All over Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, hell, even Facebook. All I saw on a day-to-day basis was Warzone clips, from random people posting their funny moments to insane clutches by some of the biggest streamers in the world. Despite not really watching some of these people nowadays due to reasons I don't think we need to talk about in this video, I used to tune in every single day to watch Doc, Nick Mercs and Tim the Tapman squatting up, roasting the absolute shit out of each other and dropping win after win, and all it made me want to do was get on Warzone and play for myself. While I think most people who love Warzone probably played the majority of their game time with friends, I was definitely in the middle where I think I legitimately played 50% solos during the day as I was full-time on YouTube at the time, and then 50% trios or quads with my mates at night. And it meant that I had very different experiences of the game, almost like I was playing a different game on my own versus playing it with friends, and that's something that I personally loved about it too. The feeling of playing solo, knowing it is just me on my own against everyone else, that was a special kind of intensity that I've probably never experienced in any other shooters, seeing as most BRs before this I almost exclusively played them with friends. But with Warzone, not only as a fan but also in terms of making content, I found myself absolutely addicted to the solo game mode and trying to drop high kill wins whenever I could find the time. One of my favorite solo experiences in Warzone was actually taking part in a solo creator tournament where the more kills you had and the higher you placed in your games throughout a 4-hour window would give you more points to your total, and after clutching up in the final minutes of those 4 hours, winning my final game right on the buzzer, I managed to finish second overall and take home about $300, all for playing a few hours of Warzone and streaming. The nerves a solo game would produce was just something else, because there was no one to fall back on if you died or got into trouble. If an enemy was pushing you and you were under the pump, the only person that could save you was yourself, and boy did it end in some adrenaline-filled wins that gave you just this immense feeling of euphoria, something that I don't think any game has ever replicated, at least for me personally. On the flip side though, playing with friends was equally, if not more, enjoyable, especially with everyone being in lockdown for a long period of time there during the game's lifespan. With no other way to catch up with my mates, most of which I grew up with spending borderline every weekend together in a small town in Australia, Warzone was really the only way we could socialize, and yet even when the lockdowns ended, it probably became our favorite way to catch up each week. The squad that I played with on a nightly basis is such a funny mix. now that I look back at it. We had myself and one other who were regular gamers for decades at that point, pretty much playing every Call of Duty and most big shooters that came out during those couple of decades. And then for the other two lads, one of them only really turned his PlayStation on once in a blue moon, and the other one quite literally bought his first console about 2 days before the lockdown started because we knew we'd need to entertain ourselves during lockdown. A team of 2 veteran gamers and 2 guys who couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag, at least when they started anyway. To give them credit, they ended up becoming pretty solid after a year or 2 of playing, and they pulled their weight more often than not, but it was just a funny combination that led to laughs more often than not. We went from never really playing games together, as like I said, the other 2 weren't really gamers, to playing 7 nights a week, every single week for what felt like months at a time, and it was often multiple sessions per day. One time I remember us playing from about 2 PM to 6 PM, we got off and ate, then got back on from about 8 PM to 2 AM, clocking a total of 10 hours for the day, only to wake up at like 8 AM the next day and jump right back on in the morning. We put in absolutely insane hours that if we did that now, I would probably feel like an absolute no-lifer, but being in lockdown, there wasn't really that much else for us to do, and I think it's fair to say that this game had all of us addicted. I think one of the best parts about the OG Warzone, which I somewhat mentioned earlier, was the flow of each game, the mix of chaos and peace, the mix of a competitive shooter and realistically just a social space to hang out. The game was designed in such a perfect way that after that initial chaos at the start of each match, if you survived and managed to clear an area out, you might have 10 to 15 minutes of the game where you're kind of just on your own, just you and your squad looting up, rotating to the circle without anyone pressing you, and weirdly, those slower moments were some of the best moments too. Nothing was funnier than those moments where you were hardly even paying attention to the game because you were just too busy talking shit in the party chat, doing would you rathers or giving each other sporting trivia to figure out while you're waiting for the circle to close in. Those are some of the moments that I remember the most, just talking absolute shit with my mates and using Warzone essentially like the pub rather than an intense video game like it was. I remember one game being dead and spectating my mates while we were just talking nonsense. We're down to the last like 15 or so enemies in the game. Everyone else in the match is no doubt stressing out trying to win, and these 2 dipshits are so enthralled with the trivia questions that I'm giving them that they are just spending their time in-game spray painting love hearts while camping at the top of a fire station. Eventually we realized how close we are to winning. They buy me back and I'm just sitting in the air like a UAV pinging enemies for my mate Renners, at which point he clutches up with me still floating in the sky, and I remember us just cackling over the voice chat at the fact that we had hardly paid any attention all game and then randomly regained consciousness at the end of a game and somehow managed to win it. There are just countless memories like that, and I'm sure all of you guys who played would have had many of your own that are similar, and those for me are what made this game so special. Talking shit with your teammates only to suddenly get pushed by an enemy team, and all of a sudden you've switched from talking about who your least favorite high school teacher was to giving clear and concise orders like a bunch of highly trained Navy SEALs in a matter of like 10 seconds. It really was something else. But on top of all the shit talking and socializing, the game was also special when it came to some of those more intense moments and memories that you made, clutching up with all of your mates spectating you or dropping a 20 bomb in a win, even a team effort of 30 to 40 kills in a game. It was those moments that have also stuck with me throughout the years too. I genuinely can't remember another game where it felt so exhilarating to be in those moments. Palms sweating, you're getting a bit shaky, everyone's all of a sudden serious on the mics and calling out every enemy that they see with precision. I've never really experienced it to that level in any game before this, and especially when I was playing with my regular squad, we knew every call out, every location, every buy station. It was like we had the game downloaded to our memory and didn't even need to think about what we were saying. Something else I find so memorable about this game is all of the different weapons that the community loved, from the broken metas to the go-to loadouts. And as much as some of those things were annoying at the time, I do look back at some of those weapons as such a fun time and such a core memory of the game. For me, my all-time favorite weapon in this game was the Kilo 141, the jack of all trades AR that carried me to hundreds of wins throughout the years. It was never really OP, but it was also never bad, and that bad boy is easily my favorite weapon in any BR that I think I've ever played. For a short while there, the Growl became the meta and you almost had to be using it if you wanted to win, and while that can sometimes be annoying, it was also kind of fun having a weapon that you just knew was going to perform amazingly well. If you run all of the meta attachments, this thing was literally just a laser beam every time you fired it. As a long-time sniper, who could forget the classic Kar 98, which in fairness wasn't always the meta. In fact, it was actually pretty shit initially, not being able to one-hit kill even with a headshot if I remember correctly, but overnight it became the clear favorite in the community, feeling absolutely phenomenal, and honestly it might be one of my favorite sniper rifles in any shooter that I've ever played. Running that bad boy with the suppressor and landing headshots might have been one of the most satisfying things throughout the entire game. On top of that, the HDR and the AX50 were also amazing and were definitely better suited for long ranges than the Kar. And so these were always fun to pull out when you knew the final circle was headed for an area with really long lines of sight, though if I'm being honest, most of the time I did honestly just opt for the Kar 98 anyway. And for SMGs, who could forget two of the classics in the MP7 and the MP5, both some of the GOATs when it came to Call of Duty already, and they absolutely lived up to that in Warzone, being perfect to pair with the Kilo or the Grau, the M4A1 or the AMAX. There was just no better way to play that ultra fast-paced playstyle than running a well-rounded AR with a fast and furious SMG in your back pocket for those close quarters situations. But on top of those fan favorites, there were also some very broken metas throughout the lifespan of Warzone, all of which were fun when you were the one using them, but dying to these over and over and over again genuinely tilted the community more than anything I can remember. One of the first ones that comes to mind was the Bruin, an LMG that literally just played like the best AR in the game, with the bonus of having a bigger magazine and what felt like absolutely zero recoil while it was broken. Pair that thing with an SMG and you were generally pretty hard to beat in pretty much any given situation. Eventually, a weapon that came to be a great pairing for the Bruin was the R90 Dragon's Breath shotgun, a blend of a semi-automatic and pump action shotgun, allowing you to shoot 2 shots in quick succession before quickly cocking the gun to continue firing, all the while dealing fire damage to your enemies too. This was easily one of the most insane metas the game ever saw, and luckily after a month or two it did get a hefty nerf, but holy shit was this unstoppable in close quarters when it first arrived. The last one that comes to mind, which came after the Black Ops integration, was the DMR and MAC-10 meta, the two most clapped weapons at each range, and obviously when paired together this just pretty much made you a walking laser beam at any range you chose to engage at. This meta was so bad to the point where it felt like 95% of the player base was using it, because if you didn't, you had almost a 0% chance of winning gunfights against those who had it. All of these little moments throughout the game's lifespan, whether they were good or bad at the time, they all just added to the story, the journey, and the experience of Warzone, and they're what makes it so memorable to this day, 5 years after launch. I've played a hell of a lot of games in my day, from open world RPGs to linear narrative driven games, smaller scale multiplayer games, sports games, massive FPS games, or smaller scale ones like COD and Halo. And honestly, Warzone is the one that comes to mind for me when I wonder which of those games has provided me with the most memories to look back on. It was a game that hit at the perfect time for the perfect audience during a time in the world that we really did need something to kind of carry us through a pretty rough period for a while there. Of all the games I've played over the years, I don't think any of them would have been better suited for a pandemic than Warzone. It was the ultimate mix of providing a fun, intense experience to keep us entertained, while also allowing for so many people around the world to catch up in the online space and feel that sense of community that we were clearly missing a little bit due to the current circumstances. While it's definitely a shame the game isn't what it used to be, and unfortunately just probably never will be again, I think it's safe to say that I am very glad that we got to enjoy it to the level that we did during a time where we all needed something to enjoy after a long day. When you look at some of the other BRs out there, probably the most notable being Fortnite, but I'd put PUBG in this category too. It's fair to say they've stuck around for the long term, and especially with Fortnite, it's still one of the biggest games out there. When Warzone launched, and specifically about 6 to 12 months after launch, it definitely felt as though this game was going to do the same thing, still being an absolute staple in the FPS and BR genre in 5 to 10 years from now. Unfortunately for us, that didn't really last, as the game really only had one super strong year, then a relatively mid-year after that, and the year after that when they added Caldera. I'd consider that to be almost a completely different game than the one I'm talking about in this video. As much as I didn't know it at the time, I think it all started with that Black Ops integration, which it's crazy to think about. That was actually in 2020, midway through December. So by that metric, the game didn't even last a whole year before it sort of started to go downhill, meaning we really only had from March of 2020 to December of 2020, a 9 or so month period, where the game was in what I guess I'd call its OG state, the state that most of us think of when we think of peak Warzone. Now, at the time of the Cold War integration, where they added all the weapons and stuff from Cold War into Warzone itself, it initially felt really good. And I'm not going to lie, my hopes and expectations for the game were even higher than they had already been during the Modern Warfare period. It all clicked initially. It maybe felt a little bit weird in places, but for the most part, the balancing was decent, the huge influx of content was appreciated, and overall, I think the community was actually fairly happy for the first month or so. The integration began with purely just the weapons and operators being added to the game, as well as Rebirth Island, and like I said, it was pretty smooth initially, but quickly we got to the point that I mentioned earlier where the DMR and the MAC-10 were running rampant, and even the FFAR, which was otherwise known as the FAMAS from previous Black Ops games. And so the first real chink in the armor started showing for Warzone when those metas hit in about February of 2021. Activision were slow to fix it, taking well over 6 weeks to nerf those weapons, and even when they did nerf them, it wasn't really the fix we all wanted. They hardly nerfed the weapons at all, and they were still some of the best in the game by quite a bit. This was the first period in the game where the entire community showed a lot of frustration with the devs for their handling of the game during that period. While there were definitely periods before that with the Grau or the Bruin, for example, none of them were nearly as OP as the DMR was, and after 6 weeks of frustration, I think in hindsight, this was probably the beginning of the end for Warzone as we knew it, even though the actual end didn't come for quite some time after this. April of 2021, however, saw the first major update Warzone had ever seen, technically removing Verdansk from the game and replacing it with, well, Verdansk again. They literally just reskinned the map, called it Verdansk 84, with it being set in a more Cold War time period, and other than some decent changes to the map, if I'm being honest, it was just a reskin, and it's fair to say the community was kind of pissed off. While I personally enjoyed the map, and looking back at how we're all crying for the return of Verdansk, it's pretty funny that they just half-assed a new map, which wasn't a new map at all, rather just a slight change up to what we already knew. And this was another area in which I think things started to really go south for Warzone. Prior to the negative thoughts from the community though, I think it's fair to say that they absolutely nailed the hype building elements for this new map with the Destruction of Verdansk event that was, to me, one of the most iconic moments in all of Warzone. A limited time mode involving a zombie outbreak began, with more and more players turning into zombies as the game progressed, and eventually a nuke was launched to wipe out the entire map of Verdansk, landing right near the stadium and creating an awesome cinematic, probably one of the most epic cinematics the game had seen so far. A few days later, Verdansk 84 was officially added to the game as the main map, and this was the last time that we ever got to play on the original version of Verdansk until, like I said, sometime in the next few weeks in the current version of Warzone. Despite all of that hype though, like I said, the player base was pretty down about the whole Verdansk 84 thing. While the map wasn't bad at all, it just wasn't quite the same as the OG map, and when you look at other BRs out there, they usually add entirely new maps, often with a completely new look or feel that really freshens up the game, and that just wasn't the case with this reskin of Verdansk, despite being a decent enough map at the end of the day. This led to a lot of fatigue within the player base, and in combination with the DMR meta that had just happened prior to this, as well as some bad communication from the devs, a whole lot of cheaters running rampant for months on end, it all just kind of came together to a very slow burn of a decline for the game, with most of us clinging on to hope that they'd fix it, only for that to never really happen. After some time, we initially got the actual end of Verdansk, which happened when the brand new map Caldera was added during the Vanguard integration, and to me, this was the true signaling of the end for Warzone as we knew it. I'm going to be really blunt here. This map was absolute dog shit and was one of the single worst, if not the worst BR map that has ever been developed in my opinion, to the point where I literally don't even have my own gameplay from this map because I just didn't care enough to keep it on my hard drive. Warzone, as we knew it, was unfortunately dead at this point. Don't get me wrong, Rebirth Island and the new Resurgence maps were still a fair amount of fun, and I continued playing Warzone pretty much all the way up until Warzone 2. But if we're being completely honest here, the Warzone that we all fell in love with was gone, whether we wanted to admit that or not. Warzone 2, for a brief period anyway, revitalized the community, and initially it did seem like a much better game than the Caldera version of Warzone, but still, it just didn't hit the same as Warzone 1. Ironically, that wasn't to do with the map like it was with Caldera, as in my opinion, Al Mazrah was actually a really good map, nearly as good as Verdansk in my opinion from a gameplay and map flow perspective anyway, but the issue was more with the gameplay itself and some core changes they had made that didn't really feel like the right decisions, alongside having to regrind for 14,000 more attachments all over again. In hindsight, I'd love to see an alternate reality where Al Mazrah was actually the map they added to Warzone 1 rather than Verdansk 84, or hell, even after Verdansk 84 instead of Caldera. I really do think if the gameplay of Warzone 1 just never really changed too much, outside of obviously some upgrades here and there, but the map and the new content was a lot better, then that game that we knew and loved might have continued on for much, much longer. But alas, that was unfortunately not the case. While that may have fixed the issues that we faced, it honestly might have done nothing at all either. Maybe Warzone was just lightning in a bottle, the most perfect mix of mechanics and an iconic map at the perfect time of a global pandemic, and maybe that was the reason this game was so special. Realistically, we're never really going to know the answer to that. Regardless, it's safe to say that all of Activision's decision making during that period is what caused the unfortunate downfall of this game, to the point that, at least for me, this current version of Warzone is almost an entirely different IP than the one that I fell in love with, and I think most people probably feel the same way. At the end of the day though, I guess all good things do come to an end, as they always say. So to tie all of this together, I think it is probably pretty obvious that Warzone, specifically that Verdansk era and hell, even the Verdansk 84 era too, is one of my all-time favorite multiplayer experiences, and a game that I just know I'll still be thinking about fairly regularly when I'm some 80-year-old fossil later in life. This game gave me more memories than I think any game has before. It gave me memories playing solo, having an absolute blast in no one's company but my own, and it also gave me even more memories playing with my best mates of 20 years, catching up every single day during a global pandemic and wanting to do absolutely nothing but play Warzone all day, every day for the foreseeable future. While it's obviously gone very downhill since those OG Verdansk days, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the game for what it was, and to the devs who worked on it during those days, I genuinely appreciate all of the work that went into making such an amazing, frustrating, but enjoyable game. I'll be shocked if there is ever another game in my lifetime that lands quite the same that this game did. Like I've mentioned a few times, it was just lightning in a bottle, an unpredictably massive success that for a while there felt like it did pretty much everything perfectly, and my god, if we do ever get another game on that level, I know for a fact I'll cherish it even more while it lasts, because you never really know how long those games are going to last before they inevitably crash and burn at some point down the line. Most of the videos I make on this channel are much more cheery, sort of looking back and celebrating the games that I cover, while with this one, I won't lie, it kind of felt a bit more of a sad video in a way. I genuinely felt levels of nostalgia that I've never felt before watching through a lot of this gameplay, and I think a lot of that is tied to the COVID period, since I think we all have such a strange, emotional attachment to the pandemic, despite it obviously being a pretty rough time in history. Hopefully the video hasn't made you guys feel too nostalgic in a bad way. It was made with the intention to look back and celebrate what was one of the best video game experiences ever created in my opinion. And here's hoping that one day in the future, someone, whether it be Call of Duty or another franchise, can capture a similar feeling for all of us that love the genre of battle royales. For those of you still watching all the way through to the end, I just want to say a massive thank you for all of the support. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, be sure to hit that subscribe button, as there is plenty more content like this on the way. If you've got any recommendations for games that you guys want to see on the channel as well, be sure to leave them down below. And I've already got a ton of content planned on a lot of anniversaries coming out this year, those like The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk, for example. But I am keen to hear what you guys want to see as well. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.